Yeah, so hi, welcome to the weekend workshop of BCS. So we'll be today going on with introduction to basic machine learning and deep learning. Um, so the outline of this talk would be that we'll be um, presenting some slides on basic machine learning and deep learning and neuroscience. After that, we'll share a tutorial for you to work on. It will be a solved tutorial and you'll have to go through it. And if you have any questions or like any doubts or something related to that, you can share that on our Discord. We have channels specifically for this prepared on the Discord server. So you are requested to please join that as well. Link is shared in the mail itself. After that, we'll have three more talks tomorrow, and we'll give four assignments of these four talks, and you will have to submit two of those in a week's time uh, for the completion of this weekend of this week workshop. So now we'll be going on over the machine basics concepts of machine learning, and it will be presented by uh, Saurav. So Saurav.
हेडफोन्स यूज कर मिल गया Just a second, guys. We are just changing our audio input. Hello. I am seeing the chat right now, so you can tell me if the volume is very low. Is it very low? All right then. Let's get started with machine learning. So, first of all, I want you to tell me where machine learning is used in day-to-day life. So you can type in chat right now. Say Google or delay क्या? Okay. But now it's still low. All right. Yes, AlphaGo is a correct example where machine learning is used. So Amazon, all right, we're getting some good answers. In Google Maps to find better roads. Okay, okay. Google AdSense. Research. Okay, so I want you to focus on research and tell me where exactly in research is machine learning used. We have a slight delay, so you have to bear with it. All right, so let's move on. So basically, machine learning is nothing but a mathematical model coded in mainly Python. It has some input data, and we get some prediction output. And the better the model gets, the better the prediction is. All right. Uh, so input data can be anything from numbers to photos to speech, audio, anything, and the prediction might vary as well. say for example you want to predict the prices of houses in Mumbai. So you would need a regression model, you would need data. The data will majorly consider say locality, the hospitals nearby, school nearby, uh, the number of people living nearby, population density, uh, schools, things that are adding up to the cost of the house. So all this input data, when it goes into the mathematical model, the model figure it out itself, and you get a prediction. The prediction here would be the cost. Okay. The prediction here would be the cost of the house. So, like, say in image, computer vision, the most famous problem of computer vision to differentiate between cats and dogs. Do you know how the model works for that? Uh, well, at the end of this session, you will be knowing that. So stay tuned. So, what is machine learning? Fitting a suitable mathematical model to the given data, just like we discussed. Minimizing the error between expected and actual output of the model. So, like I said, we predict the output. The prediction might be wrong, might be correct, and the model might not be the most optimized one. So we need to minimize the error between the expected prediction and the actual output. So we need a test data for that. So when we train on. So so there are different kinds of error. When you'll go deep into machine learning, you will come up with different kinds of error. So those errors had to be minimized in order to get a more accurate result. Everything is about optimization, the mathematical model to reduce the error in training data. So let's get started with our first algorithm, the linear regression. So you can see the photo right here. Linear regression is nothing but y equals to mx plus c. Uh, just that the x is actually a matrix of data. So recall the problem that I said earlier, the prediction of houses one. Say you have a certain feature and the house price is heavily dependent on that feature. So what you would do is to plot that feature, suppose on the y-axis, and you have another feature on the x-axis. What you get is a straight line, y equals to mx plus c, which could be used to predict a certain amount. Okay, so let's have a live example. You can see the photo right here, right? So these are the small blue dots are the data points, and the red line is the line of prediction. So suppose I want the value of uh, 20. So you can see at the corresponding point of 20 on the red line uh, might lie something between 5 and 10. So the more accurate the model is, the more accurate the prediction will be. Okay, some maths. So the W1 in the model, the W1 x1, W2 x2, W3 x3, the x1, x2, x3 are features, and the y is the output. The W1, W2, W3, these are weights, and these vary. Like say a model might not require a certain feature to be overweighted. It might require say जैसे मेरे को घर खरीदना है, so I might not care about the restaurants nearby, so that would be least weighted, but at the same time I might really care about the hospitals nearby, so the weight of that would be increased, and these come naturally. You have to figure it out yourself. So this is the matrix of like, so these x1 transpose x2 transpose, these are the datas. Oh, it is corresponding to y equals to wx, like you can see it right here, y equals to w, like x1 just shown in a matrix way. Let's talk about how to minimize error. So right here, the xw is the predicted output, and the y is the actual output, and the ew is the error between these. So ew is the square of the error, so we have to minimize that. So you differentiate d by dw and make it to 0. In a way, you get w, which is x transpose x inverse x transpose y. For any doubts, you can definitely go on Discord and ask w, and you add some learning rate, and then then you add it to your original w, so you get the new w. So you iterate it again and again, you get a better model, you know what fits better, and those parameters will be your final. So you can get in new data, predict the output, which and then check it again. Yep, the famous cats and dog egg example, logistic regression. Okay, this is a sigmoid function. When you want your output to be between 0 and 1, you usually use a sigmoid. I, okay, so if the value of a prediction is between zero point 0.5 and 1, you might predict it as a cat. And if it is between 0 and 0.5, it is a dog. How do you get this? Computer vision. You see a photo of cat, and it is broken down into tiny pixels, and each pixel is then fed into a model. So the model figure it out, and it tells you if it is a cat and dog. Okay, so now we'll move on to deep learning. Shivanshu will take up from here.
So I suppose there was this issue of audio. I will try to fix it before moving on. Okay. Um so I think this is the best that I can do currently. So if there is still some issues, kindly bear with it. I'll try to speak louder. Um, so yeah, so let's start. So as Saurav just said that, so like I'll just recap a bit. So what happens is, in a machine learning model, in a linear model that we have taken an example of, what linear regression tries to do is, like there was this data where, so like we were trying to fit a line on this data. So whenever we put some value of x, it will give me an estimate of a value of y. That would actually be our prediction of the model. So our model would be a linear one. So if we have 1, 2, 3 or 3 data points here, x1, x2, x3, given some weights, we'll predict y value. This is a linear model, and to make it better, so in this model, as you can see, there are points which are deviating a bit from the linearity. So to capture that feature, so like you can see that it the data might be following some curvy trend which goes something like this. So to curb that, we provide a sigmoid function, or basically any activation function, which converts a linear output to this sort of a non-linear output, which basically introduces some non-linearity to a linear model, uh, which might predict the data better. And here comes the part of the deep learning. So when the linear model was using only one sort of a linear relation between the input and the output, what deep neural networks trying to do is take the input and pass it on to several layers of calculation, non-linear calculation, to better fit our data. If a data has a very non-linear sort of a trend. So now I'll go to these slides. Um, so I'm not looking at the chat. Uh, समझ नहीं आया. Okay. So like I'll ask you to uh, ask some doubts on the Discord if you can. Like there is some delay in the YouTube live stream. That's why I cannot like understand where the doubt is. So it's better to like explain it out there. So like moving ahead on the deep learning part. So what happens in deep learning is, uh, like deep learning is actually a form of machine learning. So it's a subset of machine learning, but we use several layers of computations to produce our output. So as you can see, we have shown a model, a sample model, where this is the input layer, where we have x1, x2, x3 up to xp. So it will be a p-dimensional input vector, which will be fed into our model, and our model's job is to predict some output, which is again some y0, y1, y2, y9, which is a 10-dimensional vector. So let's suppose you have an image of uh, let's say handwritten numbers, where you have to predict whether it is a 0 or 1 or 2 and so on. So there you will have to input that image in some form, and your model will be required to produce an output where it will give uh, something like let's say the image contains a number 5. So the job of the model is to like give 5 as an output. So in this vector it will give 0 for everything else and 1 for 5. But that doesn't happen. So what it does is it gives some output of a number, of a float value, but then we take the maximum, sort of the argmax of the vector, where it will provide the index of that uh, number which it thinks is the output. So you can think of it as the model is predicting a probability of the number. So at y0 it will give probability close to 1 if uh, it thinks it is 0, and so on for the other numbers. So yeah, it was a example. So moving ahead, just like I said, deep learning is a subset of machine learning. So it needs to be clear that what these term means. So like in pop culture we use AI, ML and DL interchangeably, but they have slight differences. So, like artificial intelligence is something uh, which makes machines act smartly, close to human. So, artificial intelligence is something like when you play games, the opponent is like trying to challenge you. That is also an AI, but that doesn't necessarily use machine learning or deep learning techniques. And AI sort of existed even before the ML and DL era, where people try to like think about how how you can like make machines smart and do our work for us, which is like a boring thing for us. And machine learning is a subset of that, where it focuses like just like it is written on the slide, machine learning focuses on computers being able to perform tasks without human assistance. So, like machine learning actually deals with uh, sort of doing some specialized things for humans, which only humans can do. For example, looking at a picture and telling us what it sees in that, or like taking some data and like predicting what is going to happen in the future, or like making some guesses based on data and things like that. So machine learning typically consists of supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning, where supervised learning is something where we provide data and the corresponding output to a model, and a model tries to like find a suitable sort of a mapping between input and output using that data, and we use that to make future predictions. Unsupervised learning is something where the data is given and our model tries to find some hidden structure within the data. So, for example, let's say you have a data where um, so what kind of example we can take? Um, let's say cat versus dogs that sort of just talked about. Let's say we have cats versus dogs, and we are able to extract some features out of those images, and like we don't know anything about whether an image is a dog or a cat. We haven't seen the images. We just have some features of those images. Now, if we try to plot that, um, we'll see that these two are clustered on uh, in different two clusters on some input x. So like if we can find that structure and like discriminate between those two, and we can predict cat versus dog. So that might be an example of unsupervised learning. Then reinforcement learning is something where a model learns from itself. So you might have heard about the google's uh, Google Brain project, the AlphaGo and all that, where a computer actually won against the grandmaster of Go, which is a Chinese game. So like reinforcement learning is able to. So what it does is it performs some action, and the environment gives some reaction to that, and based on that reaction, model judges that whether it uh, what action the action that it took was worth it or not, and based on that it learns. Now deep learning is something which is a subset of machine learning, where like we use a specialized type of machine learning model, which is artificial neural network, and we use very deep sort of layers in those. So that's why the name deep learning comes from. We'll take a look in the on the deep learning part today. So like the neurons that we are talking about here is uh, if we go on this image, each point can be considered as a neuron, where it takes inputs from various different layers from a previous layer and gives an output. So let's step back a little. So the way a new artificial neural network is structured is that it has several different layers. It takes some input, then we have some other layers, some hidden layers, and then it gives some output. So what each layer is doing is like taking an input from the previous layer. So like x1, x2, x3, x4, xp all are fed into this neuron. It gives some output uh, to this neuron, and every other neuron in the next layer. And each of this neuron performs some linear computation followed by an activation function that we just looked at. So that we can include some non-linearity as well. So like in deep learning we use so many neurons. Like you can see, this is a small model and we still have so many neurons, like six by six, and then 8 neurons here. So like a lot of neurons, a lot of computation. But why do we need that? So what each neuron does is that it performs some basic computation, but when it is combined with the other neurons, uh, it is able to capture the non-linearity in the data pretty well, and it performs pretty well on various tasks. So what happens is, uh, just like we saw in this example of the house prices prediction, where we were fitting a linear line on the data. So the data actually shows the actual price, and the line that we have fitted is a predicted price. But as you can see, there might be a relation which is a little bit curved, not exactly linear. And if we have to capture that relation, we use some non-linear function. And this is an example of a 2D space. But what happens if we have a lot of inputs and a lot of outputs? So for example, we have like, let's say 100 or 200 inputs, which are then processed, and we have to give a single output. So in that case, what happens? We use a very deep neural network where it tries to capture all that 100 dimensional data's structure. So yeah, those deep neurons, the deep structure helps us to capture very complex uh, pattern in the data. So basically we are trying to fit every point to the data, but not exactly that. What happens is we try to fit as closely as we can, not we can, but like what we want. So that's a little bit confusing right now. So what we do is we take our data and we have to like perform well on the future data. So let's say you have some data of number plates, and you're trying to capture number plates on a running road where you have to capture the number plates and then read the number and save it. So you have to the goal of this task is not to like do it on uh, is not to like get a very good accuracy on the data that you already have. The end goal is to get a very good accuracy on the data that the model is being presented at a later stage. So to capture some sort of that behavior, what we do is we take the whole data set, which might contain a lot of images, let's say 10,000 images. Then we split it into two sets, where we'll train our model on one set and we'll test it on another set. So what we'll be doing is like uh, our model will be predicting the data which it hasn't seen while the training. So this kind of a mimics that behavior where we have to predict better results on the unseen data. So yeah, but what happens is, let's say we are trying to fit the data very closely to every point. Then comes the talk of bias variance trade-off, and what it is that let's say we're trying to fit a data which is described here, the x's and zeros. These are two different type of points. So, and we are trying to like find this relation where these two are differentiated pretty well. Now there might be some errors where this x point is way into this zeros is territory, and this might be considered as an error here. So we have to find a relation that would like wouldn't be disturbed by this anomalies and like still perform better on unseen data. And if we use a very deep model, what it will do is it will try to capture everything that our data has, and it will try to fit every point, and our classification would look similar to this, where it will classify zeros perfectly and x's perfectly. But let's say we have some new data which falls into this point. By seeing it, we know it should be 0, but our model will predict it is in x. So that is wrong. So like this is overfitting, force fitting, which is too good to be true. I'm sorry. So yeah, we try to avoid that and try to fit something like this where we sort of capture some errors but still predict something pretty good. If we like have a very little non-linearity, it'll tend to classify as something linear, and which is also not very good in terms of the accuracy that we will get on the future data. Okay. How powerful CPUs recommended for this workshop assignments? Yeah, you only need CPUs. Okay. So yeah, I talked about training set and test set, which we distribute our data into. So what the hell is that? So yeah, for example, we have said, I just described that we kind of split our data set into two, where we'll train on one and we'll test on the other, so that our model would predict something that it hasn't seen already. So what we do is we have let's say 100k images from the web and 8k images from target distribution. We shuffle that and we make a giant data set. We shuffle it to like remove any bias that already has on the data. Uh, yeah, and we like split the data into three sets: training set, dev set, and test set. Dev set is something different, where we uh, use that while our training to like kind of keep track of if it is improving the accuracy or not on unseen data. But if you like at this point do not care about dev set, that is also understandable. So yeah, I most of like I have explained this mostly. um, yeah, so like if we talk about models, uh, so there are some pretty famous models that uh, researchers use to make our life simpler. There are So these models can be anything, can be used into anything from computer vision, from natural language processing, from speech recognition, from like anything. It can be used to anything. There are several kinds of models for other several different tasks. So we have provided some examples. We have AlexNet, we have LetNet 5, we have VGG, we have ResNet, we have MobileNet. So these all are examples of deep neural networks. Like we'll not go into deep, but just so you know, these are some models that we use for like these are models for images mostly. And the Python libraries and frameworks that we use are like given in the right. Uh, I would have been asking you to identify them if we were on a meeting, but this is live stream and it will be there will be some delay, so I'll answer that. We have Keras here, TensorFlow, NumPy, and SciPy, I think. Uh, so now, what is a CNN? So as we have seen that deep neural networks are used to predict outputs of an image, can be used for an image. So CNN, what CNN is a specialized model for images, where it is a convolutional neural network, which is a deep algorithm which can take in an input and assign some importance to various aspects in the image, and will be able to differentiate one from other. So what CNN does is it convolutes. There is some operation which is called a convolution. It does that on the image and gives some sort of a stacked images in the next layer, uh, which that layer actually tries to capture some basic structure in the image. So for example, let's say one of that layer, one of that image would be trying to guess if it is a straight line, if it contains a circle here, or if it is a straight line here, or something like that. Then we apply some max pooling, which is another operation which is uh, done to like reduce the size of a data of a layer. Then we apply the convolution again. So in the next layer, what would be happening is like it will be judging whether the lines that we have identified in the previous layer uh, joins to produce number 1 or number 2 or number 3 and something like that. And we use that to actually flatten the data which is which actually gives us a feature vector, and then we use that feature vector to like uh, do a linear sort of a model, like a linear sort of a layer to predict the final output. So yeah, this is a simple example of a CNN model which is trying to predict this handwritten digit into uh, a proper number. For CNNs, we have some very popular models which you might have heard about. We have YOLO, we have DeepNet, we have AlexNet, we have FaceNet, we have MTCNN, we have a whole lot of models. We have ResNet also. So these are some of the very famous models which came into existence pretty recently, and they perform very well on various sorts of data, not only on images, but they perform well on audio as well. They perform well on time series signals as well, if we do some pre-computation, which is something I would not go into right now. The next kind of very famous deep neural network structure is recurrent neural network, where what a neuron does is it takes some input, gives some output, and then that output is fed into the same neuron again, and the computation is done based on these two inputs: the input coming from the previous layer and the input from itself, and then it gives some output, and it is fed into like various other neurons. And so what sort of it does is it takes uh, temporal sort of data and tries to capture the temporal feature that the data might have. So for example, if we have an audio, uh, then it has some temporal sort of data where uh, temporal pattern where something comes after something else and it makes some sense. So this kind of model tries to like make sense of that. And so let's say x1, x2, x3, x4 are various data points at various times, and like we are trying to take input from the previous neuron, which would give us some information about what happened at the previous time point, and we are taking input of this time point, and then we are trying to use those to predict something else, and we can like stack these on top to capture some very complex structure as well. So yeah, this is it for I think deep neural networks. What we'll do is we'll share sort of an assignment based on that after the neuroscience talk, um, and you'll be required to like go over it in preferably in the next hour. So now we'll go on to the neuroscience, introduction to neuroscience, which will be taken by Suyash. So, yeah.
Okay, we're having some technical issues right now, so if you could all just wait for a short time.
Yeah, because I need okay. भाई व्यूअर्स ड्रॉप हो गए एकदम से अटक गया यहाँ पे सब
Yeah, we're back on now. I'm sorry for the delay. Right. So, as I as I was saying, neuroscience we have made more advances in neuroscience in the last 10 years than all of the time before that, right? So, it is a very exciting field to be into right now. Uh, okay. Now we're going to talk about the subfields of neuroscience, right? Behavioral neuroscience, how the structure and function of the brain affects behavior. Like it, this allows us to understand how it's a very exciting notion, right? Like how studying the brain will allow us to understand how people act and why they act the way that they do, right? Cognitive neuroscience is there's a subtle difference between behavior and cognition, which we'll discuss in the coming slides. But cognitive neuroscience understand like helps us to understand how thoughts are formed, like how emotions, like the neural basis of emotions, uh, and also how we perform activities as simple as walking or as abstract as solving calculus, right? Computational neuroscience uses computers to simulate and model the brain's functions, and it is a highly mathematical field, right? We have to there's a lot of math involved in creating simulations of the brain. And neuroimaging is it has many applications in medicine. Like we we have various methods of scanning the brain, and this is just one example of an application of neuroimaging to diagnose disease, and to help in curing these brain diseases. But there are also many other applications, like just to understand which parts of the brain cause the brain to work that the way it does. uh, Now we are going to talk about the neuron, which is the basic unit of the brain, which the neuron creates essentially the what the entire brain does. So here's it, this might look a bit intimidating at first, but this is the structure of a typical neuron, right? There are many different kinds of neurons, right? This is just one kind, but for an overview, the nervous system is made up of many different kinds of neurons, right? And the other type of cells in the nervous system are glia. They provide the support functions for the neurons by playing an information processing role, which complements the role of the neurons. And a neuron can be compared to an electrical wire. As you can see, it even looks like an electrical wire. It transmits a signal from one place to another. Right. uh, we are now going to talk about a little bit about how the neuron does how the neuron plays its function, like how it transmits signals all across the nervous system. So what the main point of interest here is the action potential, and as you can see in this curve, the peak of the curve is labeled action potential, right? And what fundamentally happens in neurons is that these signals, these electrical signals, they get transferred through the neuron in the form of these spikes in potential difference, right? And these spikes are essentially what the neuron uses to perform these complicated actions, actions as complicated as vision or understanding, right? Here's an electron microscope image of a chemical synapse. As you can see, the this is a synapse, right? So you can see the vesicles in the images right there. All of you might have like heard of vesicles in your preceding classes, and they play a very important role in the transmission of information from one neuron to the other, right? This is a chemical synapse. There are also electrical synapses, which we will go into at some other time. Right. Now, this is a really interesting thing for me. Like, we are going to discuss the various regions of the brain. Like, up until now, we were talking about the neuron, right? Now we are going to see how these different regions of like these neurons, essentially the same kind of neurons, come together to form different regions of the brain which perform really different functions, right? So, as you can see, all the parts of the brain are labeled by their functions, but it's not as easy as it sounds. Like, there's not the part labeled vision is not completely involved in vision, and nor is it the only part involved in vision, right? So, the brain is essentially divided into three parts: the forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain. Here, we are going to choose to focus on the hindbrain, as amongst other functions, it's responsible for cognition, which is a really interesting thing to think about. However, we need to bear in mind that the human brain is mind-bogglingly complicated, and multiple parts are involved in the simplest of tasks. Right. So the forebrain is by far the largest part of the brain. The cerebrum accounts for 85% of the brain mass. The cerebrum is the outer layer of the forebrain. Right. Wait, I should probably go over this. The forebrain is the part which is at the forefront, like which is the outermost part of the brain, and the midbrain and hindbrain are respectively according to their locations. Right. So another part of the brain is the limbic system, which works with the cerebrum, another part of the brain, to control the cerebrum, as I just mentioned, is the largest part of the forebrain and also of the brain. So the limbic system works with the cerebrum to control our emotions and behavior, especially critical behaviors like reproduction or flight or fight responses. Right. And again, as I mentioned before, like this is the reason that all of this is interesting, because the parts of the brain are interesting is because uh, a lot of this these discoveries have been made in the last few decades, right? So before that, we didn't know which part of the brain was responsible for vision. We didn't know, like, if someone was blind due to an injury to the brain, we couldn't have we had no way to treat it, right? But now we do, because we know which part of the brain is responsible for vision, which part is responsible for movement. Now we're going to talk about the neuron as a computational unit, right? As it is written on the slide, a single neuron is not intelligent. A single neuron is just a wire, right? It's not really doing any computation by itself. But a network of neurons is a whole different ball game. Like, they can perform insanely complicated tasks in the blink of an eye, a literal blink of an eye. Here we are going to compare the natural brain, a natural system, and engineered systems, computer, right? So the human brain contains about like 10 billion nerve cells, and on an average, every neuron is connected to other neurons through about like 10,000 synapses, right? And the as you can see in this, the style under the column labeled style of computation, the computer is labeled as serial and centralized, and the brain is parallel and distributed. So there's a it's a fundamental difference in the way that the brain computes, right? So the brain has some really remarkable qualities which make it superior to engineered systems like a computer. That its performance, like, even if the brain is partially damaged, its performance tends to degrade gracefully, right? Like, let's say, for an example, if you if you have any all of you have experience with coding, right? So uh, most programs and engineered systems are brittle. If you remove some arbitrary parts, it's very likely that the whole will cease to function, right? But with the brain, it's sometimes, if you remove some parts, it might be that the other parts of the brain might step up and take up the load that was left, right? And this is a very interesting phenomenon which we are still studying. We still don't know how this occurs. And by far the biggest mystery is how the brain makes the mind, how the brain gives us our intelligence and self awareness. No one in the world still has a satisfactory explanation of the neurological basis of free will and of cognition, of complete picture of cognition. Right. So we're moving on to the next slide. Uh, as you can see, the neuron acts as a temporal and spatial integrator of signals. While it might sound complicated, what we're essentially trying to say is that the neuron, all the signal, we just saw the structure of a brain signal, right? it is essentially just a difference in potential, like a difference in potential over time. So what we're essentially trying to understand here is that the neuron sums up all the signals that it receives. Now, it's not as simple as that. It doesn't literally sum up all the signals that it receives, but there's a mechanism which allows the brain to, which allows a single neuron to sum up all the signals which it receives from its neighboring neurons, which is the spatial part of the spatial integrator of signals, and it also does the same thing over time, right? So hence it's a spatial and temporal integrator of signals, right? So even in the artificial neural networks that we are creating right now, we don't have we still haven't mastered the art of like of temporal integration of signals. Where we the latest generation of neural networks are the ones which are like doing which are incorporating this into their function, right? And now we're going to compare artificial and natural neurons. Like in this picture, you can see that the even like in a broad sense, even their structure looks similar, right? So even though the artificial neuron is nothing more than a mathematical function, the as you can see, it's like it's very similar. So at the simplest level, the an artificial neuron is as you just saw in the previous talk, it's just composed of weights, biases, and an activation function. So it takes multiple inputs and outputs a single normalized output based on a weighted sum of its inputs, right? And the in analogy with the biological neuron, the weights correspond to synapses, and the bias is unique to each. The bias is the element which is unique to each neuron, right? So we still need to note that like even like if you have created this single like artificial neuron, that's not enough for you to mimic the entire computational like prowess of the human brain. It doesn't exhibit some of the important behaviors of biological neurons. Like in the real brain, neurons are constantly getting created and destroyed, right? And the time sensitive nature of neural signals has not been copied right now, right? But the latest generation of artificial neural networks are bridging these gaps. And in the picture, you can see the Loihi tooth, which is the Intel's latest neuromorphic chip. It's designed to mimic biological neural hardware. And if Intel is to be believed, it will be the next big revolution in computing. So be on the lookout for that. Now we are going to talk about cognition and behavior and the difference between the two, right? So moving on to the next slide. Yeah. So what is cognitive neuroscience and why is it important? So, in a simple definition of cognition first, the mental process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and senses. Now, while this might seem simple at first, it's laden with nuance, right? A lot of things like as I discussed briefly earlier, there's a difference between cognition and behavior. Behavior is when we study behavior, we're trying to understand why people do the things what how the inside of a person is connected with his interactions with the outside world, like how why they act the way that they do. Cognition is more about how they perceive the world around them, right? And how they process it. So cognitive neuroscience is the study of connections in the brain, and it helps in determining how the brain achieves all the functions that it performs. An example is decision making. It's a very complicated field of study which in which very active research is still going on, right? And the the single most important and exciting question of neuroscience is, in my opinion, the to determine how the brain creates the mind, how consciousness came to be. And that is something that's a part of what cognitive neuroscience aims to understand, right? Behavioral neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience is the study of correlation between the brain, the structure and function of the brain, and human behavior, right? So this is also a very exciting field of neuroscience. Like advancements in this field might help us to assess, understand, and predict how humans behave. Like this is the implications of this are like limitless. Like once we are able to control behavior, it will be that's a game changer, right? Like it's apparent from the very definition of the fact. So yeah, but behavioral neuroscience can also be as simple as trying to understand customer preferences, like through by looking at their fMRI scans, right? Which is also something which we'll cover in the coming slides. Neuroimaging, how to keep an eye on what's going on with neurons, right? neuroimaging, as we discussed previously, is the science of looking at like it's the science of like studying neuron activity and the structure of the brain through scans and then analyzing those scans to reach conclusions. Right. Techniques of neuroimaging. We're not going to go through all of these, but these are some of the important techniques. MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, which you all might be familiar with. It uses magnetic fields and radio waves. PET scans, which is I believe positron emission tomography, right? It detects gamma ray emissions from the brain, and EEGs are the like arguably the simplest of all. Like they study the variations in potential. As we discussed, the function of the brain is dependent on variations in potential difference, right, across the membrane. So what the EEG does is essentially directly measure those fluctuations and then arrive at conclusions about the functioning of the brain. And the CT scan, right, using X-ray images. So first of all, let's talk about like electroencephalography. A cephalon is a head or a brain in Greek, right? So electroencephalography is exactly what it sounds like, measuring the brain through electricity. So 1 second of an EEG signal is pictured as follows, and you can see like in a single second, a single sensor of an electroencephalography apparatus gives us so much information. It's very rich in data, and a lot of machine learning and like data science techniques which we talked about in the previous talks are are used to like arrive at inferences from these brain scanning data. So electrical signals of a group of you might have seen this EEG in action in movies or like even in real life. It's very common. It's about probably the most common way to study the brain, right? Now let's talk about MRI and fMRI. We're not going to go into like the physics. Like in brief, the way this works is that we're going to talk about blood oxygen level dependent fMRI. There are different kinds of fMRI, and this is only one. So the way that this works is that you know that the blood carries oxygen, right? The main function of the blood is to carry oxygen. So the oxyhemoglobin, the hemoglobin which is oxygenated, is diamagnetic, and it doesn't affect these magnetic fields which we use to measure the activity of the brain in an MRI scan. But deoxyhemoglobin is paramagnetic, and it has a significant effect on the fields, right? So essentially we're not going to go deeper into the physics, but the working principle is that the difference between these two in their magnetic behavior is what causes us to like you can see the parts of the brain which are more active during an activity which will have more oxygen flowing to them, right? So they'll have lesser that's the way this works. We essentially measure those differences, right? And yeah, that's how MRI and fMRI scans are conducted. So thank you. Again, if you have any doubts, you can reach out to us on our Facebook or our Discord servers. And yeah, I'll give it back to Shor.
So yeah, I hope you guys got something out of this session. Mostly the talks are over now for today. We'll have 3 more talks tomorrow in the morning, I guess. I am not sure about the timing currently. So what I'll do now is I'll give you brief introduction about Google Colab, what Google Colab is, and how we use it. So like I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Jupyter notebooks, but a Jupyter notebook is something where we can run our Python code in kind of these short snippets where we just write some code and run them. Jupyter notebook are generally hosted on someone's computer or PC, but what Google Colab does is it gives us a portable option where we upload our code on like this sort of a notebook, and anybody can run this. Of course, anybody with a link can run the notebook and see what the code does. So what we'll do now is we'll share these two tutorials with you. We'll share the solved versions, So these are basically uh, basic Python tutorials from summer school, which is Neuromatch, which basically covers computational neuroscience. Yeah, so we'll share this solved uh, tutorials, and you are requested, like you're suggested to take a look in the next hour on these notebooks. Like these are self-explanatory, so like I won't go into much detail here. So it covers basic Python from a perspective of computational neuroscience, which is uh, whereas which covers this the LIF neuron model, which is linear integrate and fire model, where a neuron takes some input and integrates it linearly and fires. So uh, we have some talks about the potential and all that. So you will be required to go through that. There are some videos as well which explain these concepts in some detail. If you wish to go over that, you can do that. Otherwise, those things are also covered in the written snippets given here. So how it works is that you need to connect it first to a backend which is hosted on Google servers. After connecting, you will be able to run any code, any Python code on these notebooks. So to run any code, you select the snippet and like either uh, run this play button, it will run this code, or you can just press Control plus Enter and it will run this notebook. So it shows that this notebook was not authorized by Google, so it's a security feature, but yeah, run anyway. So yeah, it will finish and you will have these two modules imported, which is NumPy and PyPlot. So yeah, these are some figure settings and some this is the video that I was talking about. It will show a video, you can play that if you want.
Hi everyone.
Small videos from NMA Neuromatch Academy, followed by some this is a snippet where it explains what is a linear integrate and fire neuron, which is also covered in this video. So these are similar things. After that, you have some like code snippets. You can and you are required to go through these code snippets. Here, this is the unsolved version, so this does not have the solutions for that, but we'll share the solved version with you. So yeah, this is how this works. You can write your code and run in the browser itself. You don't have to download anything or install anything. Yeah, so after this, like even after the talks which are hosted tomorrow, which will be hosted tomorrow, you will be shared this assignment, um, which will be required to do in a week's time. After that, you'll if you submit any two of those four assignments, you will be given some credit for that. So yeah, as you can see, we are importing some things, we are preparing the data set, and then going over some linear regression. We are actually training a basic linear regression model to predict that house pricing thing that we talked about in the talk itself. This is also self-explanatory. Everything is written. You can go over it, and if in case you have any doubt, you can contact us on Discord. We'll be available there. And finally, I hope you learned something today, and please come back tomorrow. With that, I'll close this talk. Thank you.